you, what is art in your opinion?
Okay, so I do have a bit of an advantage because you've had a few episodes before me. Seven, right? I'm number eight.
Yes.
So I've been able to cheat a bit and go through and listen to what the other artists have said.
That's
And
perfectly fair.
yeah, and they've answered the question beautifully. And I think it's every artist you've had on has touched on a different facet of what art is. But I want to take this as a moment to redeem myself. When I was an undergrad, I had matriculated as an art major right before the art department started switching from a more representational to a super postmodern conceptual installation based program. Mm-hmm. And they were very much of the painting is dead attitude, you know. And so I remember I had a very staunch definition of what art was at that time. And it was very authoritarian and it was very reactionary. And art was, to me, just like drawing the figure, and anything else, even Rothko, Mm-hmm. And since then, I've been able to step back and look at the art world maybe with a more objective lens. And I spent a couple years working as a security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I needed the health insurance. I'm not cut out for that kind of work. But it was great because you would get to look at everything when there weren't people in the galleries. And I got moved around the museum a lot. And I can never get over how much I reference that job, that experience, because as you know, the Met's collection is encyclopedic. It expands millennia, it expands everyday objects to, again, more modern like video pieces. It really runs the gamut. And so I think, was it Max Perkins on here who said, like, if art is everything, art is nothing, or if art is nothing, art is everything. And I think the thing I've realized is, over the last 100 years, kind of starting with Marcel Duchamp, there was, again, kind of that, and I know this is something you're very well versed in, a lot more about like postmodernism as a philosophical and cultural movement than I do. But again, there was a very destructive rhetoric to it. Like, the intelligentsia was going after all these sacred cows, and it was so very reactionary. And again, it kind of created this paradoxical art is everything or nothing kind of attitude. And since then, the art market, because, living in the 21st century, I don't know, it's much more romantic to think of art as this esoteric, nebulous, inherently human phenomena. But I don't know if we can necessarily divorce that from the mechanisms of the art market anymore. That's just the era in which we live. I think it's just kind of unavoidable. So what's been interesting for me, even though at one point I was so staunchly basically against anything that had been made after 1920, like when I was an undergrad and rebelling against this great change in the art department, I now look at it and I try to be very even-keeled about seeing, not just discounting that artwork, seeing the rise of a secular art market as well, and then all of a sudden noticing how artistic movements were much more crystallized and reactionary. So, the thing about art to me is, while it can encompass so much, and while its definition has to be so broad, it can be both subjective and objective. I do try to be sensitive to the real-time pragmatic natures of the world and the art market in which at least, my own work may exist, and what that is. And what's so interesting to me is how the figure and representational art is starting to kind of trickle back into our consciousness, not just in terms of a low art level, but in terms of high art also. Like, again, I live in Florida, so I was at, some of the fairs in Miami in December, and I was amazed at the amount of what you would call like more representational artwork. So I think for me, like what art is it's kind of like a many-headed chimera that's always, it's a monster that's always kind of shifting. But if you can kind of control that monster, be aware of that monster, or anticipate that monster, it can be a beautiful monster. It can be a beautiful, beautiful nemesis, if you work with it rather than against it. And geez, I took like notes too when I was watching the other episodes. Where'd they go? I have really messy handwriting. I also liked what Alex Suka said about art as a visual way of solving a problem. And that's probably something that would relate to a lot of what I saw at the Met. Artwork from all over the world that served a lot of different purposes. And it's interesting to see problems being solved in a way that are visual rather than relate, or at least have another sensory experience as their